Okay, good morning everyone, and can I welcome everyone to the 25th meeting of 2019 of the Social Security Committee. Can I remind everyone present to turn mobile phones or other devices to silent mode or to put them off so that it doesn't disrupt the meeting. No apologies have been received this morning, and we move to agenda item 1, decision to take items in private. The committee is asked to agree that item 4, consideration of evidence that we'll hear today, is taken in private. Is the committee agreed to that? Thank you. Moving to agenda item 2, benefits take-up. This is the second evidence session of the committee's inquiry on benefits take-up. Today, the focus is on how the design and administration of benefits can affect take-up, and can I therefore welcome Judith Patterson, Head of Advice and Rights Scotland, Child Poverty Action Group, Richard Gass, Chair, Rights Advice Scotland, and David Wallace, Chief Executive, Social Security Scotland. Good morning, and thank you for supporting our inquiry here this morning. We're hoping all three of you will give a brief statement to the committee before we then move to questions. I'll leave it to yourselves to arrange who goes first. Judith, do you want to?
Yes, thanks, Convener. Just to start off with, just so there's no doubt about my role here, I am giving evidence for Child Poverty Action Group. Some of you will be aware that I'm also a member of the Scottish Commission on Social Security, SCOSS, but I'm not here to represent SCOSS views. SCOSS will have its own collective view on take-up. So with my CPAG hat on, if I may, just a couple of points to start with. We're very seized on Scottish Child Payment starting at the end of next year, and the need for every eligible family to take up their entitlement, otherwise children will be left in poverty. So it's right that take-up shouldn't be left to intermittent awareness campaigns, important though they are, but that take-up activity needs to be properly effective. It needs to be continual, it needs to be embedded in practice. It should be national and it should be local across Scotland. The other key point for us is that barriers to people getting full entitlement should be identified and removed, and that's both in the initial design of a new form of assistance as it's coming through, but also really importantly through continual learning as the system embeds and people start to claim and encounter difficulties. So there needs to be continual organisational learning to make sure that those barriers are identified and removed to maximise take-up.
Okay, thank you. Mr Gass, Richard Gass, do you want to go next?
Good morning, thank you. I'm here today representing Rights Advice Scotland, but my daytime job is Manager of Welfare Rights in Glasgow City Council. I've worked in welfare rights since 1986, so I've seen benefits come and go and seen many a benefit campaigns, some with success, some with less success. Would echo what Judith said about removing barriers, and we can identify that the current benefit system has a number of barriers. And it feels like these barriers have been introduced deliberately to limit benefit claims or benefit expense, and just highlight on maybe a couple of those. The personal independence payments came in to replace disability living allowance, and at that point the government was advising that disability living allowance was no longer fit for purpose and looked to manage the expenditure down by some 20%, which I don't think has been successful. So personal independence payment was introduced as a cuts measure. And part of that process required folk to receive a letter to invite them to make a phone call, to make the phone call to be sent a claim form, which hardly is supportive of encouraging folk to actually make the claims. A second one was the mandatory reconsideration process, where people were given another decision, but the purpose of that was to reduce the number of cases proceeding to appeal. And the third one, universal credit, being digital only. It seems that all of these were driven by efficiency of the agency without full recognition of the needs and requirements of the claimant. So in any take-up campaign for the future or take-up strategy for the future, these are the type of barriers that need to be overcome.
Okay, thank you. David Wallace.
Good morning, committee, and thanks again for the opportunity to give evidence to this inquiry. As you know, I've kind of spoken to you recently, and when I did that, I sort of outlined some of the role of the organisation. I just wanted to quickly sort of put that on the record before the session as well. So Social Security Scotland is the delivery organisation for Social Security in Scotland. The policy and programme operations behind benefit take-up remains with the Scottish Government, and that goes for the benefit take-up strategy as well. So the Social Security Scotland, for example, won't have a role in determining applications for the new start-up funds. That's a Scottish Government decision, and neither will we be involved in the payment of those funds as well. With programme colleagues obviously sits that sort of design of applications and designs of systems, and as we've already heard and no doubt we'll explore further, that plays a really important part in the ability to take up. That currently sits with programme, and obviously as an agency we work really closely with our policy and programme colleagues to ensure that meets our needs as well. And in terms of the take-up statistics as well, those are being driven currently from Scottish Government analytical colleagues as well. So having said what we don't do, I'll just say a little bit about where I think Social Security Scotland does have really important roles in this. So I think one of the things that, again, we've spoken before about is what it feels like for a client to engage in our organisation when they're seeking benefits. And that's absolutely my role to ensure that feels right. We also have a really important role in terms of our strategic communications around about benefits and the marketing of particular benefits. And increasingly over time, our local delivery network, which again we've spoken about previously, will be a really important element of the joined up service that we've talked about. Just want to say a couple of final things before we open up. Like lots of elements of the agency, we're still in our very early days of building. So we're very much in that sort of build, test, learn and incrementally building up from smaller benefits into larger ones. And as I said previously, I think how we engage with our clients, how we make it easy to claim and how we treat them through that process will be really important. And again, I think already we have some good examples of how the organisation has been doing that. Local will play that really important role of joining up services. But again, just for the absolute record, our local delivery teams are not designed to be replacement benefit advisors. It's around about pre-claim support, it's helping people through the application process, and it's help signposting and joining up, but it is not designed to replace either cabs or others that are operating in that space. But what they will do is do that joining up, linking up on the ground, and again I think we've got some good early examples of that happening. So I just wanted to kind of put that sort of structure in place before we moved on. So thank you.
That's very helpful. Thank you to all three of you for your opening statements. I might just start in relation to, I think, a point Mr. Garth made very well. Whilst I'm not going to look at the details just now of what the barriers may be in relation to getting a high uptake of PIP, or even what the policy intent may have been in terms of being restrictive and to save money. And you gave examples in relation to universal credit as well, and other members wish to talk about the almost digital by default and the barriers that places. This inquiry, if you like, is turning the whole thing on its head and saying, if you were to design a system to maximise benefits uptake, how would you do that? So we may return to those matters, but in a Scottish context, of course, we've had Best Start grant come out now. Actually, we've discussed before with Mr. Wallace that the initial uptake of that was higher than initially planned, but my understanding now is that it's at 67%. Now, if you were to compare that with a child benefit, which has an uptake of 93%, I know they're not directly comparable, those two benefits, but it does beg the question, whilst we're delighted that 67% of claimants are getting the Best Start grant elements that they're entitled to. Could we do better than that? And more importantly, I suppose, is there anything in the eligibility criteria that could be tweaked or changed? I think it brings it back to Judith Patterson's point, that sometimes you can tweak slightly criteria without actually undermining the policy intent to target it a benefit. So there's a good example to start off. There's a new benefit and entitlement that we all support around this table. We've got a strong uptake, but we could perhaps do better. So any suggestions in relation to that, how we could do better? Judith Patterson.
Yes, I think so. I think it's a really interesting contrast, isn't it? That Best Start grant, it's actually for a first child, it's only 53%. So I was quite surprised to see those take-up figures, to be honest, given that the high numbers of claimants who'd put an application in. I think there's a huge difference between child benefit and Best Start grant. Child benefit is a universal benefit. Everybody gets it. It's really clear the relationship between your own circumstance, you've had a baby, and your entitlement. You're entitled to child benefit, and there's very little that gets in the way of that. Your mum, your sister, your friends, the nurses in the hospital, the doctors, everybody knows about it. Everybody gets it. So there's umpteen chances to make your claim for child benefit and very little getting in the way of that. Whereas for Best Start grant, the key difference is that in the middle is you have to get a qualifying benefit, like universal credit or something. Now, when babies are born, the reason I think that take-up is lower for the first child is that that's a key life event that means that people are actually claiming a qualifying benefit for the first time, with all the barriers that entails. So it can actually take a while for a first mum to learn that they've got an entitlement to a means-tested benefit, to get a claim in, to have it assessed, and only after that can they make a successful claim for Best Start grant. I think that's maybe what's getting in the way. Could we tweak Best Start grant to improve that? Probably. Best Start grant, unlike child benefit, has got a window to claim. If you claim outside of that, you don't get it, and you can't get it back if you've missed it. Child benefit, you can claim whenever you like, and it's backdated for 3 months. We could change Best Start grant to allow people to claim later, when their benefit's awarded, and just backdate it. In a sense, backdating doesn't matter. It's just a grant. Just let people claim it when they get a qualifying benefit.
Okay. Any other comments on that, Mr. Gass?
I would agree with the window for claiming that is in itself a barrier. Another problem I would suggest is that it's called Best Start grant. Child benefit, quite clearly it's child benefit. Best Start grant, unless you're familiar with benefit language, you could mistake that for maybe, is that a payment for when you move into employment or for some other event? So I think over time folk will become familiar with Best Start grant as being a payment for in respect of children, but perhaps we're not there yet. Another thing that could be tweaked would be if the eligibility criteria was extended to include council tax reduction, because you'd then open up opportunities for local authorities to be able to interrogate their council tax reduction records and actually realise, well, we've got these people here who are entitled, and we could then be proactive in bringing information to people.
Okay, thank you. David Wallace?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of add to what's already been said, I mean, there is something around about how long child benefit has been established for as well. So I mean, we're talking about something which is well understood and kind of absorbed. For Best Start grant, even for the earliest payments, we are still working on less than a year's worth of data. We'll hit that anniversary next month. So the uptake figures are based on a very small data set. I think we can come with that warning as well. So I think that's some of the things we just need to be kind of mindful of it as well. Best Start grant as well, we might come on to in terms of automations. There are some good elements in terms of how that operates without requiring huge amount of evidence in the background to be provided, which I think are built into that process, which are worth reflecting on later in the session as well. But I don't disagree necessarily with what's been said, but I think we are working on very, very early data. I should just briefly pick up on the language point being made about what the benefit is called and what that means to people. As the committee know, whenever we do a benefit and a launch, we are testing what language means, and there's never a unanimous view that this is exactly what it should be called, but that terminology of Best Start grant was tested with people with experience of the system and others to try and do that. And that's something that we do for all of our benefits.
Okay, now I won't pursue the point of automation just now because my colleagues will want to pursue that later. But one of the things we know that Social Security Scotland has done in relation to the first wave of entitlements from the Scottish Government and Social Security Scotland was reaching out to individuals that you think might qualify, whether it's carers allowance supplement or whoever. Do we know who qualifies for Best Start grant or who might qualify? So without looking at automation, we know when babies are born. We surely have that data. There's GDPR issues, obviously, but there must be postcode areas, there must be maternity units where you think there's a particular prevalence of mothers who are most likely to qualify for Best Start grant. Is there any proactive work that Social Security Scotland is doing to reach out to those who might be most likely to qualify that otherwise might not apply?
Well, for Best Start grant in particular, for the first launch, we did work with health visitors and so people who were clearly engaged with people having children. So that was a fairly sort of straightforward and obvious mechanism in order to get those messages out. And again, that's something that we would repeat as that goes through as well. So on a communications point, who we work with as a set of stakeholders as benefits rollout, absolutely. I'm not sure if your point was around about collecting of data rather than actual work on the ground. Though.
Well, I suppose you need to have the data to best inform you about how to do some of that work on the ground. So is there any barriers in relation to data or data sharing that would be useful to maximise benefits uptake, I suppose would be a reasonable way of putting it?
I'm not aware of anything which would have helped us target that at launch any more than we were able to do so.
Okay. Given the evidence that Mr Gass gave in relation to barriers in relation to PIP and universal credit, I'm just wondering, this committee will get the first set of draft regulations in relation to disability assistance for younger people relatively soon to look at. The Scottish Government's very keen to make sure that there's a more supportive, customer-facing, friendly, one-to-one approach, avoiding assessments where they're not required, more long-term awards, the types of barriers that Mr Gass that you think are inherent within PIP. As far as you're aware so far, do you think those are likely to be removed when disability assistance rolls out in Scotland, or what more? I know it's difficult to comment because we haven't seen all the regulations yet, or what more could be done. So what assurances do you have that things will be done differently, or what more could be done?
Within the take-up strategy, it's quite clear there's going to be multi-channel applications. So the fact that we will return to the availability of paper forms without having to phone up and get controlled stationery should help us overcome that barrier. At present, a welfare rights officer can go out to visit someone with a view to making a PIP claim, and what they have to do is make a phone call in the company of the individual and then await for a specific form pre-populated with some technical details to be sent out, whereas in the past what we had were stock blank forms. If we can return to something where we've got stock blank forms, then when we turn up in somebody's house and discover a PIP claim, we can just make it there and then. So I am reassured that things will be better. I have also got some suggestions for how things could be made even better, and that would be that, and this isn't just in relation to PIP, but maybe in relation to something like Best Start grants, that in hospitals where you've got pregnant women and new young mothers, then if there's leaflets with something as simple as a QR code, given that a large number of young mothers will be young, new mothers will be young, then maybe more au fait with digital technology. If you could simply just scan a QR code and then put in your name and say, I want to claim this benefit, something as simple as that, and fire it off, it could be done there and then. There's so many maybe other things that could be done. There's so many other things that need to be done after the baby's born, that getting round to finding the form or the claim mechanism. If someone could do it from a QR code, then that's just one suggestion of how we could perhaps improve things.
Okay, any other comments on that before we We move on, Judith Patterson.
I mean, I think the changes to the assessment processes is going to be more significant for PIP, for the adult version of disability assistance, because that's where there are face-to-face assessments at the moment that are going to be largely removed in the Scottish system. So I think we're heading in a good direction in terms of helping. The key thing is to help individuals make the best account from the beginning of their own personal circumstances, rather than having impersonal rote statements about people that are distressing and don't help get the best decisions from the beginning. So I think if the assessment can mean we get a good decision from the start, rather than the minority of people who succeed to get through to appeal to get the right decision, then that's going to be a real plus for the system. In terms of disability assistance for children, I remember some time back talking to a parent of a disabled young person who told me that she'd never heard of DLA throughout her child's early childhood, throughout school, and it was her child was severely disabled, and it was only when the child was an older teenager and she engaged with support groups that her peers in the support group told her about DLA, and she should have been claiming for the last 15 years for her child. So I think in Scotland we can do an awful lot better than that, and I think that's where the Social Security Scotland's and the Scottish Government's take-up strategy comes in, to make sure that people find out about the benefits they're entitled to every time they have an engagement with a professional, with a trusted professional, whether it's in health or education or social work, wherever it is, so that never again does a family wait 15 years to get their entitlements.
Okay, thank you. I'll take you in a wee second, Michelle, for a supplementary. I'm going to roll up a couple of questions together for time constraints so other members can come in. But I'm just wondering if you've got any suggestions you can make to the better linking together of different benefits, so maybe a better use of passporting, again that tweaking of the system to make it more effective. Now I get that can have unintended consequences because you've got to be able to cost a benefit and make sure you're still targeting appropriately, but can you give consideration to how passporting or other devices could perhaps be used to maximise benefit uptake, and also, I mean, aligning eligibility criteria might be helpful in terms of saying, well, we know it links back to passporting again. If you have a similar eligibility criteria for different benefits, there's definitely advantages for that, because you can do that assessment once rather than several occasions. But that also could have unintended consequences, I suppose. So, in terms of aligning eligibility criteria or the better use of passporting benefits, is there any suggestions you'd like to give the committee this morning, Mr. Gass?
Free school meals, clothing grants, Best Start grant, Scottish Child payment, they should all have the same effective means test around them, and that should include eligibility for council tax reduction. That would make things so much simpler. If there's different rules for different benefits, then it's going to be complicated for advisors, so it's going to be very complicated for claimants. So I think that we could certainly improve there, and I can't understand why the one means tested benefit within the control of Scottish Government, council tax reduction, is being excluded from the list of eligibility. The whole benefit system for Scotland on these benefits are at, if DWP make changes, they affect Scottish benefit entitlement. So it just seems very strange that that's not been included. There might be technical reasons for that, but it just seems very strange it's not included.
But that's helpful. That's the kind of thing our committee would be keen to pursue. Judith Patterson?
I suppose one simple example is the difference between Best Start grants and Best Start foods, where they're both based on qualifying benefits, but there's an extra layer of means testing attached to Best Start foods, in that you've also got to have earnings below a certain level. So I guess there could be more alignment. I mean, you can already claim them together, as far as I understand. But I think if they could be aligned more closely, then that might make it easier for people to avoid dropping in and out of entitlement as their earnings changed. But one of the things I'm kind of quite more concerned about, I guess, with the system is there's an awful lot of underclaiming when it's left to an individual to report that they've received a benefit that then means that they're entitled to a passporting benefit. And at the moment, there are systems for different parts of DWP or HMRC to communicate with each other, to let, say, tax credits know that a family's received DLA for the child, and to put that entitlement automatically in place. But legally, it is for the family to report it, and that's a problem, particularly if in the Scottish system we don't have the right communications in the background. So basically, the more that we can get departments and agencies to work together and make that happen, so that families aren't left to report it themselves, the better. And I don't think there's any need why that, there's no reason why that shouldn't happen.
That's helpful, David Wallace. I know some of this could be considered policy rather than delivery, but would some of the things that are suggested there make it easier in terms of the administration and delivery of those benefits for Social Security Scotland as well? And what would your reflections be?
I mean, I think through all of this, our drive is never to make it easy for Social Security Scotland, and Judith touches on the single application for Best Start grant and Best Start foods. So that is an element where actually it's been quite clear the aim is to make it straightforward for the client claiming, and that actually potentially adds a few more, as we've discussed before, manual processes and in the background for the agency. So the process is never around about what makes it easy for us. I think it's absolutely what makes it easy for the client. I think data sharing clearly offers huge opportunities for us to do things, and I think as we develop, those things will absolutely be explored. I would pull us back a little bit to the safe and secure, which is not the excuse for not making improvements in systems. It's about just that recognition, as we talked particularly about Scottish Child Payment, that we are in the midst of a hugely complex and difficult transfer, and at the heart of what we're trying to do is around about that safe and secure transition for clients moving across, and this is still relatively early days, even for the live benefits, despite the ones that are still to come our way as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Michelle.
Yes, good morning. Mr. Gass, when you talked, I just wanted to pick up on something you said about going back to blank forms and taking them out to clients when you went to see them. And whilst I appreciate that paper form needs to be available, I just wonder whether you really felt that actually your welfare advisors returning to blank forms would aid efficiency and in administration, and also in terms of getting turnaround quicker. And I mean, I know when I was sort of updating my services, what we did is we issued mobile apps that they could take out with them and fill the forms in there and then with the clients. Because obviously what you want is a very quick input to the agency, and you also want to actually eliminate data entry errors that occur when you send paper and somebody enters it and they're doing piles and piles of them over a day. So I just wonder whether you really meant that actually we should go back to giving paper, whether that was just a last resort approach.
Paper as a last resort. I'm certainly a supporter of electronic forms, and putting on a Glasgow City Council hat, all our welfare rights officers have web-enabled tablet devices. So yes, we would, if we had an electronic form, we would look to use that. The barrier I'm looking to remove is the fact that you put an artificial phone call and then await for something in paper to come through in the post, because what the DWP are sending in the post is a paper form. If we've got something where we can identify you might be entitled, how do we now do that in the here and now rather than put it off to a later date? So paper, telephone or digital form would suffice.
But that paper form is being sent out in request to a paper form. So actually the elimination is not requesting paper in the first place, but finding a way of uploading immediately.
Yes, we want to be able, if we could fill in an electronic version of a claim form and press a submit button, then we would be delighted.
Right, thank you.
Yes, David Wallace.
I'd just be saying, that is effectively the Best Start grant system that we've got. So we absolutely wanted to ensure that paper was an option. It has been a seldom used option. 90% have been online. The rest have generally been telephony. I think a handful have been paper application forms. But ensuring that the options are there, I think, is the absolute key we've been trying to do.
Okay. Jeremy Balfour.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If I can move us on maybe to looking at the administration of the benefits, and particularly when people are making the application in the first place, and specifically around those who maybe have specific disabilities such as deafness or visual impairment. Maybe start with Mr Wallace, because just looking at how the agency will work, do you see some kind of webcam, sign language, online tours for those who have specific disabilities, so that they're not excluded in regard to kind of take up of that? And how, if I can just give a practical example, you know, if I've got, if I'm completely deaf, how would I interact with the agency if I'm making an application, either as a parent or as a disabled person looking for a benefit myself?
Yeah. So again, we've put in place for the current benefits, we're doing translation service. You know, BSL, we're working with BSL, it's available in a range of languages. And inclusive communications is one of the things that we recognise we now need to work slightly different to as we get to the more complicated benefits as well. So we have now in place an inclusive communication stakeholder group who have met at least once and will continue to meet to give us that feedback as to how we should make this accessible for people who require additional help as well. But there are things currently in place for you know, the current benefits, and we'll continue to develop that as we go on.
I mean, can I push you particularly on deafness? Because obviously that in many ways is a disability which you can't phone up, you can't have that face-to-face unless you've got somebody there to interpret for you. Would you see a specific team for those who have hearing loss or deafness sitting within your team?
So we have been working with the Scottish Government's BSL action plan as well, whether that needs to be a specific team, but I would absolutely expect us to be able to offer a service in the same way as we do for everyone else, which fits into that as well. So again, I think it's one of those things that we will develop as we go into the latter benefits. And I came back to my other point about the face-to-face as well. There might be something that's required very locally around about that. So I wouldn't say structurally it sits as a separate team, but it will be part of our overall inclusive communications.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, was that specific to Mr Wallace? Any other reflections on that before we...
There exists a text phone mechanism which DWP currently employs, so I wouldn't imagine that the Scottish Government would not do similarly. But I think what's important would be you need to make it as easy as possible for someone to make a claim. And if you can strip it back to something simply, I want to claim, and lodge that with the agency, and then have the onus on the agency then to say, right, we know somebody wants to make a claim, how do we now bring that about? And if that contact saying, I want to make a claim, can establish a date of claim, then that takes us a good way forward.
Okay, thank you. Mark Griffin.
Thanks, Convener. Just if I can say first, carrying on from that discussion, I wouldn't want anyone watching not to be aware of BSL Contact Scotland, which is government funded, and any deaf BSL user can call that video relay service to contact Social Security Scotland, book a dentist appointment, or engage with any other public service. So just to put that on the record, Convener.
Absolutely.
When we're talking about administration of entitlements, there are obviously a range of bodies who administer those, DWP, HMRC, local authorities, Social Security Scotland. I just wanted to ask about the perception of how alleged fraud is dealt with, whether there's a perception that alleged fraud is dealt with aggressively or not, impacts on benefit uptake.
No one's making eye contact, that's never a good sign. Mr Griffin, Judith Patterson.
I mean, I think there can definitely be a fear factor in terms of benefit claiming that can put people off. I suppose I would say the fear factor, in my experience, isn't necessarily related to fraud, because the level of fraud in the benefit system is low, so people tend not to know people who've had experience of that, but they're likely to know people who've had other negative experiences. So, for example, being put into debt through making a claim to benefit, and that can be perhaps because they've had to take out a loan, say in the universal credit context, because of the delays in making a proper payment. It can be because they've been sanctioned. So I think people are quite fearful of... People need security of income, and anything in particularly means-tested benefits that undermines that, it means that you're worse off, I think is a very off-putting for people making a claim. And I think in terms of the fraud, there's often two concepts sort of joined together when they shouldn't be. The concept of being overpaid a benefit and the concept of that being a fraudulent overpayment. So there might be quite a lot of instances of overpayment that might be completely innocent or might be official error. And unfortunately, a lot of those are recovered from people. And in my view, they shouldn't be. And that is the kind of thing that does put people more into debt. So I'd say that's what the system should focus on, the overpayment and the recovery, and making that as light touch as is possible and consistent with having a robust system.
Okay. Any other comments?
On the show, I'd say that it's not something I recognise from my day-to-day work. Folk don't come forward to our welfare rights services to make fraudulent claims. Anyone who's minded to make a fraudulent claim is wide enough to do that by themselves. Where folk will come forward to us is where, as Judith mentioned there, in situations of overpayment. So folk can find themselves in a situation whereby there's been a change of circumstances. For example, a son or daughter comes back to live in the house. Maybe it isn't immediately obvious they're staying there, and then several months later it's not been disclosed and there's then an overpayment of housing benefit because of a non-dependent deduction. So we'll have folk coming forward to us at some point in the future when they have been advised of an overpayment to see can we help them with that. But in relation to fraud, it's not something that we see in our day-to-day work.
Mr Wallace, do you want to add anything? And I should note, I quite like the expression wide enough by Mr Gass there. David Wallace?
Really just to echo and enhance, I mean, I think we are quite clear inside the agency to distinguish between fraud and something that looks like mistakes and errors, and that's something we're really mindful of. Fraud is not, as is described by Richard and others, getting something, a change of circumstance slightly wrong, making a mistake, not understanding that is not fraud. So we are quite clear we will tackle and go after people who attempt to defraud the system, but equally we will deal with overpayment in a way that is sympathetic to the circumstances as well. And we've had circumstances where we're quite clear we have made an error and therefore that has been written off, and there's other circumstances where we're looking to recover. But I would distinguish absolutely between the fraud and something that has just ended in an overpayment.
Do you want to come back into that, Mark?
Yep, thanks. I mean, there certainly seems to be a perception that perhaps the DWP are an agency which pursue alleged fraud to a greater extent than others, whether that's unintentional or not, and seeking recovery of unintentional overpayments, however large or small. But I was interested in a written answer I received from the Cabinet Secretary, which said that Social Security Scotland had passed 627 cases of fraud interest from the agency to DWP, and not wanting to have Social Security Scotland to have that same perception as DWP does, whether your view on whether that's an expected level of cases to be passed over, or what the agency would expect to happen to those cases.
So I don't have that PQ in front of me. I suspect those numbers might be as a result of callers to the fraud hotline, where we do have a line where people can report fraud into the system, and inevitably a lot of those calls have actually not been in relation to benefits that we're currently administering. They've been in relation to other benefits, and that's probably why there's a high handoff rate at the moment. I couldn't comment on whether DWP aggressively go after fraud or otherwise. I think we would expect to go after people defrauding systems, and I think you and your colleagues on PAPLs would absolutely expect as an organisation to do that as well. So we will tackle fraud when we see it. But I suspect that level that's being quoted in that PQ is in relation to calls to our hotline rather than internally identified cases.
Okay, thank you. Any more information you could provide on that number would be appreciated.
Alistair Allen.
Thanks, Convener. It's been alluded to, but the quality of decision making around decisions on benefits is obviously of vital importance, and particularly important on that is the impact of training. I just wondered, looking ahead, given that there's changes in the system just now, whether you feel that training staff in a different way to avoid error, you've referred to error in some ways, in the future is something you're all thinking about.
David Wallace, yes?
Yeah, so from our perspective, absolutely. I think there's the technical sort of system error, system training, which we're doing, and is kind of key to how we bring people into the organisation. And again, as I've spoken here before, as important as that is the making sure that people who work in the organisation have a sense from our stakeholders and people with experience of the system as well. So our training is both what's required to operate systems, but also what's working with stakeholders to understand the wider circumstances that we're operating in. But we'll always look at how that can be refined and improved, and as we kind of wind up to volume as well. The next big sort of training exercise we will undoubtedly have is around about Scottish Child Payment as well. So we're sort of learning those lessons, and we'll build those in as well.
Judith Patterson, yes?
Yeah, I think the other thing that we find at Child Poverty Action Group is that there are some pressure points in the system, and that's around complexity. Some areas of real complexity around, for example, people from abroad having to evidence right to reside, where the level of error in decision making is very high. And there's other situations like that as well. So one of the things that, in terms of staff training, you need to know what to train them on. So if you can identify what those pressure points are, ideally in advance, if not, then by being very alert and having channels open to organisations and individuals who are seeing those systematic problems and dealing with them as soon as they arise. So helping staff deal with the complexity is really important, and reducing the complexity where you can as well. But I'd also see the training being in the kind of wider sense of that. So it's training and resources for staff to be able to deal with these matters, and so making sure they've got the right guidance to help them to deal with that complexity. The other area where we find that there's often issues in terms of decision making is where there's discretion in the system. So where eligibility or a process isn't based on law, it's based on a decision maker or a practice that it can go either way depending on the circumstances. And staff need to really be good at exercising discretion so that it's done consistently and sort of properly in relation to people's individual circumstances. And again, that's where guidance and training comes into play.
Okay, Richard Gass, want to add anything?
If staff are trained to understand the whole benefit from let's see if we can help someone get this benefit, to be an enthusiastic advocate of the benefit, then perhaps when they approach it, it's not as it is currently where it's mechanical without really understanding that there's a human being behind this. So I think if the training is holistic, then perhaps when they come to exercise areas of discretion, the discretion is being exercised in a pro-claimant manner.
David Wallace, yeah.
So I would agree absolutely in all of that. And if I can give just one quick example around about this. So at the moment, there isn't necessarily much discretion in decision making in the benefits we're currently administering, but the training that we do exactly to try and understand there's a human behind us trying to make a claim. So whilst we don't yet have a fully up and running home service, we did have an example of somebody phoning, one of our client advisors phoned an individual looking for some additional evidence. And it was quite clear from that call that somebody was distressed on the other end of that call. So rather than just end the call and wasn't related to us, they were able to recognise that something was wrong in that because of the structure and the training, the culture, was able to then elevate that within the organisation, found one of our local leads who's in the basis of setting up a service across Scotland, and through that actually went out and had a home visit to that individual. We were able to deal with our benefit, but then equally we cross-referred to one of the local cabs as well for some additional advice and support. So again, a very small microcosm of a system that's not quite fully up and running yet. But absolutely that training and the individual involved in that was astute enough to recognise that although the process didn't say this is what you do in the circumstances, there was something recognised in here that made that work.
One measure perhaps of the quality of decision making is the number of decisions that end up in either reconsideration or appeal and perhaps being overturned at that stage. Is that something any of you have given consideration to as to how you'd like to see that operate under the new benefits and whether you would regard that as a measure of, in a way, success or failure of the quality of decision making if large numbers ended up in that situation of reconsideration or appeal?
We are very keen that decisions are correct from the very beginning, and I don't think anyone would disagree with that. And there's a real opportunity to make that much better, because it's a particular issue with disability benefits, because it's so much a matter of judgment about whether people are entitled or not entitled, that we really need to support the client advisors to make the best decision from the very beginning, and that includes being good enough to be able to look at an application form and see the gaps. So in a sense, that's what welfare rights advisors are very well able to do. They can see where somebody is going to fail because they've just not given a good account of their situation, rather than that they're not eligible, and help the client to fill in the gaps. And we need the agency staff to be able to do that too. So no, I wouldn't see it as evidence of success if there's loads of appeals sitting in the system. On the other hand, CPAG argued quite strongly as the bill was going through that there shouldn't be a two-stage process to get to appeal, that you should, if you're turned down in your application and you want to challenge that, that should go through to appeal without you having to say again that you want to appeal if an internal reconsideration, redetermination goes against you. But that's not happened. So there's two stages. So I think we've learned from the system as it is that people drop out during the course of that, not because they're happy with their award, but because they're worn down by the effort of continuing. So we need to make sure that our system, albeit it is two stages, helps people as much as possible for that to be no barrier at all, so that nobody fails to get to appeal because they're worn down by the system.
Richard, I would completely agree with that the mandatory reconsideration was brought in as an intention to limit appeals. Many a person feels that, well, I made my claim, I had a second shot, what's the point in going any further? Whereas we know the success rate at appeals sitting above 65%, as high as 80% in some areas. So, and we made the same response that a Scottish version of the mandatory reconsideration should not be a barrier to folk exercising their right of appeal. A reason why a number of cases will fail at the initial claim is that people don't know the threshold. Do you need a sledgehammer to crack a nut? So someone's filling in an application form, giving an account of their health, and people tend to try and be positive about their own condition and not necessarily focus on some of the personal problems that they may have. If we're going to have an electronic version of the form, then if folk are completing that form and ticking a box to say that they have a difficulty in this area, then it wouldn't be beyond the realms of possibilities for the form to be advising, well, that you've described yourself as falling below the threshold. Do you really want to be saying more about your health?
So you think the forms could elicit information actively in that situation?
Well, if you've given someone a warning, not warning, that's maybe the wrong word, but alerted them to the fact that from the boxes they've ticked, they're not going to succeed in this claim, and invite them to review the answers that they've given, then on that occasion someone might think, well, I'll maybe talk about my continence or other things that they didn't feel comfortable about taking in the first instance. We know that the reason why we win appeals is when we go to the tribunal, we've got a very different person to perhaps who was in the claim form, or indeed very different to who was assessed by the medical assessor. And we've got the real person.
Do you want to add anything, David Wallace? We've got a few supplementaries which we'll take in a little second, but Mr Wallace?
We've probably spoken about redeterminations previously as well. I think the only thing to say is I think it's not yet clear what a healthy level of redeterminations is overturning yet is in the system. We have made it, again, easier to ask for a decision to be reconsidered, and we understood through the bill process CPAG's views around about this. But from the agency's perspective, this was about simply allowing us to take another look at a case to see if we had got it wrong and quickly correct it. So this thing's about speed of doing that. As I've described before to the committee, as soon as somebody indicates that they're not happy with that decision, we would get in touch and try and understand more why they thought they were eligible and what it was they weren't happy with. So again, I think the look and feel of what that is really important for me. But I absolutely would take the point that I think once we start seeing decisions overturned at appeal, that is when there'll be some real learning in the system. And there again, I think we could agree that feels far too high, the number of appeals that are being overturned. At the moment, all of the appeals information and the data is small numbers are being upheld. So I'm kind of comfortable that where we are, I think the determinations, we still need to build up that body of evidence, and absolutely what I don't want to do is make it harder to go through a redetermination process. That fundamentally should be as easy as it can be. And then we need to be able to look at it from the client's perspective, and if they need to be overturned, that's fine. And as an organisation, I don't want to set a target that worries people about overturning the initial decisions.
Okay, now we do have a number of, thank you Alice, a number of supplementaries before we move to the next line of question, which will be Keith Brown. So we've got Shona Robertson, Jeremy Balfour and Michelle Ballantyne. So we'll try and get all three supplementaries in. Shona.
Morning. I just want to explore this a little bit more about the subjective and discretionary element, and I'm thinking particularly around PIP decisions mainly, that the decisions quite often hinge on the report from the medical assessor, and you've touched on that a little bit. So how do we bring a more consistent quality of decision making around those supportive reports that are going to come to very much influence the judgment of the person making the decision? So, I think we would have all around this table probably had cases where you look at the judgments made, and it's very difficult to understand how that person has come to that conclusion, but nevertheless the conclusion they've come to has been very detrimental to their PIP claim. So how do we, and I'm thinking particularly in cases where it may be mental health problems. I'm thinking of a case of 20-year standing of a severe and enduring mental illness that was then overturned on the basis of the person being able to make eye contact, for example. And I'm sure there are cases that we can all cite where you really do wonder about the level of expertise. So how do we bring that consistency to those supplementary reports that quite often are the root of a poor decision that can quite often be won on appeal?
Richard Gass.
When we're going to appeals, then at that stage we're inviting individuals to get a specific medical report from a specialist that's involved with them, or their GP if that's the only person they're dealing with. And at that point, what they're getting is a focused report. Up till then, the information, and I know that Social Security Scotland is going to look to seek information that's available in local authority records, etc. But that information is going to have been collated not for the purpose of securing benefit, but for the purpose of providing the service that they were engaging. And I'm still fearful that those reports will fall short of what's required. Mm-hmm. It's only going to be when you actually ask someone questions that are relevant to the eligibility criteria for the benefit, like how far is someone able to walk, mm-hmm. etc., that you're going to start to get those answers. So I think there's a fair challenge. Ideally, you want someone who's an advocate for the claimant from the outset, helping them to complete that claim form, but there's not sufficient resources for everyone there to have a claimant, an advisor, help them make that claim.
But is the training adequate for the medical assessors in terms of what they're looking at? Because it seems to me that there's such inconsistency there, and and real diversions of like the level of expertise. So should there be something done around a requirement of training, of competence, of...
Well, I think anybody, if someone's conducting a medical assessment, then they should be qualified in that area. We've had cases where it was somebody who was a qualified occupational therapist who was making comment on mental health, and that's really not their area of expertise. So, yes, training, but also if someone's medically qualified, that their medical qualifications should really be relevant to the area that they're making a report on.
And at the moment, that's not in a requirement at all, is it?
No.
No. Which, right. Would you say it should be? That there should
I
be...
think that should be the case, yes.
Okay.
Okay. Jeremy Balfour?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting line of evidence that we're hearing. I suppose two quick questions, one to Mr Wallace and one to Mr Gass, if that's okay. We are obviously going to look at regulations over the next year for all these different benefits coming down. And I hear a lot about you talking about flexibility, that the agency wants the flexibility to do this and that. I'm just wondering, how does that relate to regulations that, as a committee and as a parliament, we will say, this is a procedure that needs to be followed. Are you looking for some kind of wiggle room, some kind of flexibility within these regulations that maybe isn't there within the present ones? And I'm just wondering how that would work. And then my question to Mr Glass is, I mean, obviously, under law now, everyone will be entitled to advice and assistance, and I think that will be a challenge for us, how we fund that, but that will be a change. But in regard to short-term assistance, is there a danger that everybody will appeal? Because you might as well appeal and take the money. And is that something that could block up the system? And how do we monitor that in regard to kind of making sure the right people do appeal, but on the other hand, we don't just end up with everybody appealing because we're going to get the money and don't have to pay that back, if that makes sense.
Okay, two specific questions there for Mr Wallace around flexibility.
So I think when I talk about flexibility, it's not about flexibility in terms of legislation. I think I would agree. Judith have said these are going to be entitlements that are based on legislation. The construct about the whole of the organisation was on the basis that we are administrating national entitlements. This is not a lottery. It's not a discretionary benefit. Where I talk about flexibility, I guess I mean around about flexibility of the client experience in the service. So the example I gave earlier, where you have flexibility in the system to recognise and take the actions that people need to take, looking from the client's perspective, rather than looking at a set of instructions that suddenly comes to an end and therefore the interaction comes to an end. There was another really good example we had recently of that flexibility. Again, we don't have a local service in place yet, but when we launched funeral support payment, we've also been working with funeral directors, and a funeral director was aware of our local lead as a result of that and contacted them directly and said, there's an individual, an elderly lady who I know has had to bury her son and she's not able to complete this form. Can you help? The system, in terms of the agency's structure, and that currently says there's not a service in place. But the flexibility was, of course, we helped, and we got somebody out to that house, and online were able to complete that form. And again, at the end of that, there was a cross-referral to a local charity as well. So that's what I mean about flexibility, around about putting the client at the centre of the service, not flexibility about making these benefits discretionary. The whole rationale of being an executive agency was these are national entitlements.
Mr Gass, like short-term assistance was the theme?
Well, if someone's been receiving a benefit and that benefit's then stopped and they choose to challenge it, then absolutely they should have their money until it's been finally determined by a tribunal. On the other hand, if you're talking about somebody who's made a speculative claim for benefit and been turned down and then exercised the appeal, should they be supported pending their appeal? Well, I would say that when people come forward to us to claim disability benefits, as I said in answer to the earlier question, we're not having folk coming forward asking us to support them to make a fraudulent claim to benefit. The person is coming to make a claim for benefit because they believe they're genuinely entitled. And there will be some cases where someone has just completely misunderstood the benefit in which case we'll explain, well, this benefit doesn't really relate to yourself. But if someone wants to continue with a claim, then that's their right to continue with the claim. If you're going to have a system that says that they can be supported pending an appeal, then I'm not sure how you'd introduce something in there to choose who were the genuine and the non-genuine. I think you would have to leave that to the tribunal. But if someone feels they are sufficiently disabled to make a claim for benefit, then we shouldn't be putting barriers in their way.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and Michelle Valentine.
Yeah, I went to look at the issue of why so many claims were going through to appeal and through mandatory reconsideration. And the absolute majority were because, and the reason they were successful was because new evidence was submitted. That if it had been submitted at the time, they would have got their claim, if you like. So clearly there's an issue about the production of evidence at time of claim. And a continuous learning curve around that. But when we were looking at it, and you've touched on it a little bit, Mr. Gass, around the issue of what evidence can be done and how it can be translated on a form and how people describe themselves on a form, which would suggest that you do need somebody alongside them, which was part of why face-to-face ones were originally put into place, so that people could explain and there could be a conversation about it. So we do seem to have an enormous hurdle there around how we do that, because if it's just form-based, if it's going to be evidence-based, then there's going to be a huge demand on GPs who are already struggling to deliver their services for written evidence. And I wondered if when you've been looking at it, you have kind of siphoned some of this down and thought realistically, because we all know what we'd like in an ideal world, but then there's an operational reality out there of how we can actually make it work. And you said that, in response to, I think it was to Jeremy Balfour's question, that ideally you should, in fact, no, I think it was Shona Robeson, you should be appropriately medically qualified. But that could actually then lead to huge waits, waiting for somebody who's appropriately medically qualified in whatever condition that person is applying for. So I just wondered if you could touch on the operational reality of some of this.
Well, hopefully not everybody's going to require a medical assessment, that they're going to be the minority. My suggestion would be that if a person's filling in a form then and signing it has a true account of their condition, that they should be believed. I know that there's provisions in the system to try and to obtain some information from local authorities. So you'll get that information back, you'll then make a decision. I don't see that everybody will need to be medically assessed. The ones that are successful, they're great, they're out the way. The ones that are unsuccessful, then that's perhaps where there maybe is some merit to the reconsideration process for them to be advised, well, you didn't quite reach the threshold. But for folk to be not just simply told you got this number of points and you've not succeeded, they need to have something that's meaningful, that almost explains to them how they could then perhaps improve upon their application to reach that threshold, if indeed that's possible.
Right, so a written feedback of why you didn't qualify and what would be required.
That would certainly be helpful.
Although that presumably would be better in advance with the information by each question. So when they're filling it in the first place, so you use the example of incontinence. So a tick box, do you suffer from incontinence, for example, and they tick yes or no. An information box that says exactly what that means and broken down.
And the suggestion I had earlier was that if folk could be alerted on their electronic claim form, not just with information, but a kind of running points total, so that they can see if they are within reach of the benefit or if they're miles out of reach. And if somebody's miles out of reach, then perhaps what should be suggested to them there is that on the information you've provided, your claim is unlikely to succeed. We would advise that you go and seek advice from X, Y or Z.
Okay. Judith Patterson wanted to comment on that?
If I may, yes. I totally agree that when people get to tribunal, the reason that tribunals give for success is that there's new evidence in front of them. But in the most part, that new evidence isn't medical evidence that's been supplied. It's the evidence given by the person themselves. In response to the questions that the tribunal ask. And it's usually the first time that person's had a chance to say, to talk to somebody in person about their own case. So I think it's making sure that our system, our new system, gives that opportunity at a much earlier stage. So medical evidence might be important in some cases, but most important, I think, is to get the evidence from the person themselves. And yet, I think it'd be great to look at if there's new ways to use technology to do that. But we've also got to be mindful that we don't design systems around people who are most able to use digital technology, but think about the people who are in vulnerable situations. And there was a model from the past. It's called the Benefit Inquiry Line, where people claiming DLA and attendance allowance, as it was at that time, it was before PIP, could phone the DWP staff and they would help them fill in their form over the phone in the kind of way that an advisor or an advocate might do, so helping them to give their own account. And then they would send out that form for the person to sign in return. And that was quite a good model, I think, to help people give the best account. And with the Social Security Scotland, we've now got the opportunity of the frontline local delivery staff to be able to play that role, but there's no reason why we couldn't have a central inquiry line as well to help people give that account.
Thank you.
Okay, Keith Brown.
I'm just struck by the comment in CPAG's submission that says there have been no estimates of take-up rates for personal independence payment and none for other disability benefits since a study in 1998, which estimated that between a half and two-thirds of people potentially eligible did not claim. That was for a disability living allowance care component, which gives us an idea of the scale of the problem. I think, though, the example that was given by Mr Gass earlier of a QR code really interested me. I'm very interested in this idea of automaticity, although I was struck by why it's not the case that Best Start's maybe an obvious reason Best Start couldn't be paid as soon as somebody registers the birth of a child, as long as they can maybe have to tweak it to make sure it's the first birth. I don't know, but which goes to my point of if the idea is that these benefits are actually rights, do we always have to rely on people claiming them? You don't always have to claim your rights. And also, is it not possible that through more use of technology, and I appreciate the limits, as Judith Patterson just said, to technology, and they can't be applicable to everybody, but much more use of technology can be made, for example, to prompt another benefit to be paid when it's clearly the state holds evidence, verifiable evidence, that someone's entitled to a benefit. And that also gives you entitlement to another benefit. I mean, the obvious ones, you mentioned council tax reduction, but things like Best Start grant or school meals. On the enrolment of a child at a school, that's a prompt, it's a legal thing you have to do. The state has a lot of the information which would allow them to make these payments without any hassle at all. And there must be scope for IT systems to cover a lot of that. It won't cover people with language problems, some disabilities, mental health issues and so on. But it could cover quite a lot. I just wondered what you think, in particular Mr Gass, because you mentioned a couple of times about the way that IT might help this. How far you could see that going?
In Glasgow, let me get this right, the school clothing grants are automated as best we can. So if there's a child who is born in Glasgow or addressed in Glasgow and goes to a school in Glasgow, then they can, because the council tax reduction is a qualifying or a qualifying benefit for the clothing grant, we're able to do a bit of cross-referencing with council tax. That's just why I'm so persistent on the fact that council tax reduction holds so much information that would be helpful, maybe not for the disability benefits, but for the other entitlements. And it should be the case that if information already exists to show that you're entitled to a payment, then I agree, it's a right that that payment should then be sent to the individual. If the individual does not wish the payment, then they're at liberty to send it back. And I think under the current economic climate, I don't imagine we'll get too many payments being sent back.
But how far do you think it could go? I mean, those seem to me to be the relatively easy things that could be done. Known benefits, what the qualifying criteria is, and using the information that the state has or is provided by the individual, whether or not through an advisor or an intermediary, to allow payments to be made very easily. But surely it can go much further. Just on the disability benefits, which is often quoted as the most difficult one to do, and understand that. And just to give an example of, I have a constituent who has got mental health issues, and she was asked at interview, can you say what 12 times 11 is? And she said yes, and that was accepted. And she was asked quite anachronistically, can you use a telephone book? And she said yes. So when her sister went along with her, said, can you now ask her to use the telephone? And she couldn't. And she couldn't tell you what 12 times 11 was. However, if you think about the way that we fill out forms online for, say, insurance claims or credit applications, surely it's possible, even with the prompts that you suggested, to say, think about this and these are different options, surely it's possible to automate a great deal of this and thereby allow the advice agencies and others to concentrate on those that will need additional support.
I can't say anything other than I would agree with you that yes, better use of technology for those who are able to use it would then perhaps take them out of the area of need for support from advice agencies, allowing us to support folk who maybe aren't less able to use that. But the point Judith made was well made, and that is we need to ensure that we don't have a two-tier system, that if we have a slick service for folk able to use technology, then additional supports need to be provided for those who do not.
David Wallace?
I mean, I think it's difficult to disagree with that vision of what technology can do. The carers allowance supplement is probably the example we've got at the moment where, you know, we took data from DWP and just paid people. There was no application process as part of that. Now that's slightly different because it's, you know, building on a benefit that will eventually come our way. But that was by no means a straightforward bit of technology to necessarily put in place. And as we're hearing from previous discussions, you're then reliant on the rigour and the data that you're taking from another body as well. So I think that vision is difficult to disagree with. Getting to that point, you know, does have some technology challenges to put in place.
Judith, yes.
I think realistically the opportunities to automate disability benefits are very limited. By their nature, they're not based on simple things like, for example, diagnosis. They're based on complex things like the impact on people's daily lives and mobility. And I think realistically, in terms of getting take up routinely embedded, it's going to be routinely embedded in the practice of health visitors and midwives and doctors and teachers and so on to ask questions of people who are potentially eligible and get them on the right road and have proper referral mechanisms into advice agencies. Like the Healthier, Wealthier Children model that the committee heard about earlier this month, which we would regard as a kind of gold standard of that embedding routine inquiry and referral to advice agencies to help people to tell their own story.
Do you want to go back into that, Keith?
Well, just to say that, because that's the most difficult area that, as you quite rightly say, in terms of disability benefits, a lot of which can be subjective, although surely it's not beyond the wit of people to come up with systems that could, in some cases you can't because the person's going to need assistance, I understand that, but there could be all sorts of multiple choice questions in there which, or even information that's currently held, whether it's medical records or other, which might give you a lot of the information. It could reduce substantially the amount of those subjective areas where additional need is required, or in those areas where there's no subjective information required. It's a statement of your medical condition and the things which inevitably follow on from that. There must be scope, because if you can do that, if you can take, say, 60% of it on and make it relatively automated, then the additional support you can give to that 40% would be huge.
I see nodding heads there. Just to pursue a little bit further, maybe Keith, on automation. So Scottish Child Payment, I think, and I've better double check the stats, I keep quoting it, I think if I remember it correctly, it's anticipated an 84% uptake for the new Scottish Child Payment. Now, I know that's a targeted benefit. There's no, I don't think there's any plans to automate that once it comes online. Is that a missed opportunity? What would the barriers be there to doing some of that? Is it an IT barrier? I'm just curious to know what your thoughts might be, David Wallace.
Well, I think the Cabinet Secretary outlined last time she was in front of the committee that there's going to be one of the circumstances where we're paying the benefit quickly, or as quickly as we can, is one of the overriding things that we're trying to do here. And in order to achieve that, the way that we're going to be able to do that is to base it on the existing sort of platform for Best Start grant, with again the point I think the Cabinet Secretary made at the last meeting, the more that gets tweaked through processes, or the more people sort of deviate from that, the more complexity we add into it, and the more that potentially threatens that delivery and the knock-on of Wave 2 as well. So it is fundamentally at the moment taken on the basis that this is the quickest way in order to get the money into people's pockets in the similar way as to carers allowance supplement was as well. So that's the overriding driver of it. You know, where it then goes in the future, I guess, is a discussion.
So in terms of that discussion then, would Social Security Scotland be thinking now, because it's better to think 4 steps ahead rather than 1 step at a time, thinking now about, well, once we embed Scottish Child Payment in, we've got a successful transfer of the required data, is operating successfully for under 6s, we're going for that big rollout for everyone else. Are you thinking strategically now about how automation could be built into the system, given the thing that Keith Brown was saying about there could be IT barriers to doing that, so the lead-in time could be quite substantial?
It depends what we mean by which bits we're talking about automating there as well. So again, it's based on an underlying entitlement. So you know that essentially is automated. That's information that we'll take from DWP. It's based on the Best Start grant application process. So yes, it is an application, which CPAG and others will argue is a barrier, absolutely. But it's a relatively straightforward process that's been put in place there. And again, that's been tested to make sure that it is a simple and straightforward process. So it depends which bits we'd be thinking about automating.
Yeah, well, the answer is we simply don't know. We're just keen to explore what the options are. If you like, we're trying to scrutinise policy makers and delivery agents rather than actually knowing. Taking it absolutely in a wee second, absolutely. Now, it's interesting because we've spoken already at the start of the session that the Best Start grant is, depending on what elements, is in the 50% plus uptake or 60% plus, depending, looking at it overall. But it's a much higher uptake anticipated for Scottish Child Payment. So if we're using Best Start grant to get through on Scottish Child Payment, why would there be such a different variation in uptake? I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to better understand the relationship between both.
I think the short answer would be we don't want to rest at 67% of uptake for Best Start grant, so that wouldn't be our ambition of resting there. Getting that uptake higher has to be something that collectively we get to.
Okay. Judith Patterson, do you want to come in?
Yes, I mean, I think automation in the sense of not having to make an application at all, Scottish Child Payment won't work unless eventually that happens, because the assumption is if I've understood it correctly, is actually every single person who's eligible for Scottish Child Payment will take up their entitlement. And the 83% is about the larger eligible population for the means tested qualifying benefits. So 83% of everybody potentially entitled to a means tested benefit gets it based on the child tax credit estimates. So that's now our baseline for Scottish Child Payment. And to reach the 83%, every single one of those people are going to have to claim Scottish Child Payment. The only way that's going to happen is if it's automated. So we understand that there's going to be a future-proofing in the regulations to allow that to happen in the future. So I'm glad that the door's not closed to the potential for automation, because there will be more children left in poverty if it's not automated. So that's absolutely clear. I'm not quite sure what else you could do to raise the take up to that level that's necessary.
Well, it probably just means I need to improve my understanding of it. But when you said Judith Patterson, it sounds, David Wallace, as if we're effectively going to be moving towards automation in relation to Scottish Child Payment, because if we're using data from tax credits and others, what then happens after that? What will the process be by which we'll move from using that data, identifying entitlement and delivery?
Well, I'm probably not. I'm saying I can understand why you would want a benefit that simply appears, but I'm not close enough to that yet to say that we're anywhere close to the ability for a Scottish Child Payment just to simply appear in somebody's bank account yet. I think, again, in order to do this, it's a significant move. It's a significant, additional benefit coming into an already crowded and complex programme of activity. This is the only way we have a chance of making this successful. The longer term, I'm just not close enough to how you would get to a point of saying that a Scottish Child Payment would appear. I think there's a significant body of work would need to be done to get to that point.
Okay, not ruled out, but it's not going to happen in the near future.
I would set expectations.
That's for sure, yes. Michelle Ballantyne.
Yes, actually that links in quite nicely to what I was going to ask, because obviously the qualifying benefits, one of which is universal credit, which is ultimately going to be the key qualifying benefit for this, I'm guessing. So as everybody moves over to universal credit, that automation will become simpler, because that's the linkage that you predominantly need. That if somebody is on universal credit with children, they would then automatically get the child payment. Would I be correct in saying that?
There are other benefits, and there's the discussion we had about residency before and other elements of it. So again, it comes back to the automation of what data we're able to get from DWP directly for that. But yeah, it's clearly one of the main qualifying benefits.
Thank you.
Okay. Alison Johnson.
Thank you very much, Convener. Thank you for all the helpful evidence you've given us this morning. We know from evidence previously heard that good welfare advice is obviously key to ensuring the best possible take-up. And I'd be interested to hear in particular from Judith Patterson and Richard Gass about whether you feel the welfare rights sector in Scotland is in a position to help increase the take-up of devolved and reserve benefits, particularly in relation to workload and capacity. And yeah, I'll ask that question first, if you don't mind.
Okay, Richard Gass, yes.
The advice sector, I think, is stretched to capacity. There's regularly reported that there's waiting lists or waiting times to see an advisor, and a lot of the complexities that have been introduced through the welfare reforms have meant that it's no longer a case of you can see somebody and do a quick fix and move on to the next person. Effectively, you become a friend for life, as it were, because if someone's been turned down for the work capability assessment, then you fix that for them, they're going to be coming back again in 6 months, a year's time, because that's going to be a problem again. So yes, the welfare rights sector, advice sector rather, is stretched to capacity. So if you're looking for greater input, then either we need to improve our productivity, which I don't think we're really capable of doing, or you would need to be putting in additional resources.
So you think there's definitely a tension there between firefighting welfare reforms and doing that longer term work to increase take-up?
I think that's a very good way of putting it. I mean, in our experience, advisors are really bogged down, not just with the complexity of new rules, but also with the increasing difficulty of actually dealing with officialdom. They're hanging on the phone for 45 minutes, for an hour, just to try and get one thing progressed in a claim. So that's really not helping. In healthier, wealthier children, the reason that is successful, one of the reasons it's successful, is that resources are put in both sides, are put in to health visitors and midwives to enthuse them and encourage them to make referrals, but they're also put into the advice sector to make sure they're resourced to take those referrals, so that people are not just put on a waiting list and seen in 4 weeks' time, but they're given an appointment and seen in a timely fashion. So yes, absolutely, specific extra resources need to be put into advice services so they can properly link with the frontline professionals who are referring and boosting take-up.
And do you... So the Scottish Government's take-up strategy has now been published, and I just on the issue of funding, there's £500,000 preparation fund to help organisations prepare for the new devolved benefits. I wonder if you think that is sufficient, and also what kind of barriers are going to be faced by those who are less likely to engage with social security. And there's another £100,000 funding pot. Is that likely to be enough to encourage increased take-up by those who are, traditionally less likely to seek help?
I mean, if I may add, I think the funding's hugely welcome, but it isn't based on deciding what do we need to put in place and how much will that cost. It's here's a pot of money and we'll do the best that we can with it. So it's quite a different approach. So I think I would rather see something far more systematic. Let's look at what works. There's lots of evidence out there of initiatives that have boosted financial gain, but there's maybe not enough research into how that translates into take-up, which is something a bit different. But these initiatives too often remain in the realms of the local, and they don't get extended to become national programmes available to everybody. And I think that's where the Scottish Government can really play a really important role in taking the best of those local initiatives and making them happen nationally, and then deciding how much that's going to cost. And let's pay for it, because that's a strategic priority.
Yeah, sounds very sensible.
Thank you.
I don't know if you want to respond to that. I've got one further question, Convener.
Nothing much more to add other than the amounts of money that are made available are not going to substantially bolster the advice sector. Those figures are too low. But just a kind of gripe that local authorities are specifically excluded from applying for those funds. And it just seems that local authority, there's a wealth of experience and expertise, and there should be some way of actually embracing the whole advice sector to address this, rather than make a pot of money available which is exclusively for third sector.
Okay, thank you. The Child Poverty Action Group submission refers to the role of universal benefits in achieving high take-up, and I note in particular the evidence in connection to free school meals for primary 1 to 3 that take-up rose when universal entitlement was introduced, even amongst those who were entitled under the previous means-tested system. Some means-tested benefits have relatively high take-up, of course, but is there something specific to universal benefits that encourages people to take them up?
Yes, and I think child benefits are a really good example of that, and I think that's where stigma plays quite a big part. So there's very little stigma associated with claiming child benefit. In fact, people barely regard it as a benefit at all. So I think universal benefits means no stigma, and that was exactly what happened in that free school meals example. It was the removal of stigma by making it universal that led all of the families to claim their entitlements. So I think that's one of the key differences in universal benefits. But the other main thing is just the opportunity that brings to make a benefit straightforward, non-complex. And particularly not complex in how it's seen by the people who are needing to claim it. Sometimes universal benefits can have a bit of complexity at the back end, like a state pension, for example. I mean, that's based on contribution conditions rather than being truly universal. But no one ever needs to say how many contributions they've paid in any given year. That's all done for you. And then you're told what you're going to get. And it's very easy to understand it. You reach retirement age, you claim it. Same with child benefit, you have a baby, you claim it. And all your friends and your family, everyone knows to tell you to claim it. So universality means that everyone knows about it. You're not relying on somebody in a CAB who's a specialist to give you that information. Anyone who's around you when that life event happens can tell you what you're entitled to.
Thank you.
You just correct all the positives there about a universal benefit. But when we look at the means-tested benefits, there's actually an additional negativity in there, and that's been the whole sanction regime. And I'd ask the question, was the sanction regime introduced to penalise claimants, or was the sanction regime introduced to influence the thinking of the non-benefit claiming population, that there's people out there getting benefits to which they're not entitled? And with that kind of ethos, and you just have to turn on the television on any given day and there's programmes pushing this point forward, it makes it an almost insurmountable hurdle to try and get over the stigma for folk who are entitled to these benefits to come forward and make the claims, because they're not going to shout to their neighbours that they're claiming these benefits. Whereas why shouldn't they be allowed to do that? I don't expect you to answer, right?
You can answer if you want. Alison.
No, I'll stop there, Convener, but thank you very much.
I'll let you in a second, Jerry, because we do have time, but I wanted to pursue, I think, one of the points Alison was making as well. And it's in relation to advice and assistance and benefits uptake strategies. And of course, we've got the Scottish Government take-up strategy published in October, specifically for those benefits that are devolved or will soon to be devolved. The people we all serve don't distinguish between local authorities providing a service and offering support, the Scottish Government with a system of support, or the UK Government, and they really just want a coordinated strategic service and support at a place, time and choosing where they need it with as little barriers as possible. Now, there's almost a contradiction within the entire system, and I should point out that I had the privilege of going to meet advice workers in Glasgow who were representing, I think, local authorities across Scotland, Mr Gass's organisation, and very much the appeal that came from the floor when I was speaking to those advice workers was local authorities are best placed to coordinate local advice and support services in a strategic way. Yes, of course, in partnership with government, but they're best placed to do it. If I was to speak to Citizens Advice, they might say that they're best to do it. The Scottish Government might think they're best to do it. And we were in Wester Hailes just the other day, and we got some really good quality granular support networks that exist there to help people who have entitlements and have barriers to claiming those entitlements. So I suppose I'm giving a context to the fact that should there be a one Scotland approach to welfare advice and support in terms of the global sum of funding that exists in Scotland, irrespective of whether it's a UK benefit, a Scottish benefit, a local authority support, if there should be, where should that sit? Should it sit at a Scottish level? Should that then be coordinated through local authorities? If we roll up local good best practice to share nationally, Judith Patterson, could that squeeze out some of the granular good quality local providers? Because like, CPAG do exceptional work, but I could imagine CPAG could bid for a Scotland-wide service that could then replace funding that was previously going to a small local provider. So I'm trying to give a context of a fragmentation of the system, unclear what the global sum of money going into the entire system is, what is actually given in individual strands that have to bid for at a Scottish level, a UK level, a local authority level. And I'm not trying to paint a picture of something that's not working out there, because there's a lot of good practice that is working, but if we're looking at a Scottish Government take-up strategy, and we've got Mr Gass here who is trying to coordinate local authorities, not just his own in Glasgow, but across Scotland, then what would your response be to, is the system fragmented? Should there be a one Scotland approach to this? Should we map out the funding that exists? How do we know the various organisations are meeting the outcomes that we want them to meet? So no one question there, more a reflection that I'm hoping to get from the witnesses about how we can improve strategic coordination of advice, support and benefit uptake. It's probably only fair to start with Mr Gass once I've put all that on the record.
I think there's always been a bit of a tension within the advice sector with regards to funding, and almost a degree of competition. If there's a limited pot, then this agency, whilst fighting the same fight as another agency, when it comes down to funding, it's a bit cutthroat, and everybody wants to protect their own funding. You then had, in some local authority areas, more strategic approaches to funding, where funding then wasn't just an annual event, it might be a 3-yearly event. And looking at the advice across the whole area, and then allocating funds on either a competitive bid or by other means. And that can then work locally, but there's tensions to be worked out, because if there's winners, there might be losers, and until you then end up with kind of a new equilibrium, there's maybe an element of tension. But you finally get to the new equilibrium, and then that's kind of upset slightly by the fact that then there's other monies coming in for advice that are not being funnelled in through that same way, and then agencies can apply for that particular pot of funding, whereas they might already be getting funded to do the exact same thing by the local collective structure. And there really needs to be, and I think the Scottish Government embarked on it a good number of years ago, and that was a review of the money that they were providing for information and advice to ensure that it did work hand in hand with what was happening locally. And it won't be a one-size-fits-all, because in some areas you might have no local authority service and only a CAB, and another area might have only a local authority, no CAB, and an area like Glasgow where you've got local authority, CABs, law centres, local advice centres as well. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, but there does need to be we need to see a conclusion to that strategic review of how the Scottish Government manages its money, and maybe move away from just a press release announcing that this pot of money is available, and then a year later an announcement there's another pot of funding available. It doesn't seem to have, from where I sit, the future vision and the joined up structure.
Okay, that's helpful. Judith Patterson?
I think I would agree with Richard. The kind of stop-start nature of some funding is really not helpful for advice services to build on good practice locally. I mean, for starters, I would say that in terms of take-up, that whoever's doing take-up activity, that needs to be across people's entire range of potential entitlements. It shouldn't be in silos, so that the agency just does take up on Scottish social security assistance, and local authorities just do housing benefit and council tax reduction. People's lives don't work that way. It's not the best way to work. So let's all do take up in a holistic way. I mean, I think the examples of good practice have arisen because the local agencies are innovative and vibrant, and when funding has gone into them. But I think if not a kind of a top-down approach to what the pattern of advice agencies should be, there could at least be more joined up work. And I'm thinking a bit about the child poverty strategy, where there are targets for health boards and local authorities to meet, and they're having to map out their child poverty activity, including take-up activity, because income maximisation is critical to that. And that joint working, and every local authority and every health board is having to do that, will give perhaps a way forward for how we can have a more strategic approach, which might lead to having, say, a kind of a minimum expected level of service across every area, so that rural areas, for example, don't miss out on service, but without losing that kind of local innovation.
I wanted to raise as issues that have been drawn to my attention. Mr. Wallace, do you want to give a reflection on that?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for the sort of the Scottish Government's approach to the entire advice sector. I mean, a couple of things just from our perspective. The approach, and we've had this debate quite a lot around about what our local delivery advisors will do in particular, and we are quite clear it's about having a service that you don't need to go to a third party to explain. And that's kind of quite fundamental for us. If you want to find out something about the services we deliver, you can come to us and you'll get that, and it shouldn't take 45 minutes on a phone to get that kind of input to it. So I think, and certainly as we develop that kind of how those integrate, questions are still going around about, but the purpose of it is quite clear for me. And then thereafter it's where it refers on to. And that will also bed in as to where we put our local delivery people around about Scotland as well. So again, I've mentioned before, we are not seeking to create another place on the high street or wherever where you have to go to access one of our local delivery partners. That's about trying to find a place where they're already embedded, whether it's local authorities or other third party or third sector sort of advice services. So that's the approach we're taking as we try to put people around about. But I can't comment for the wider point around about the whole of advice services.
Can I just check with a couple of kind of mini questions, if you like? That's Mr. Balfour to kind of finish what we're questioning this morning. Do you know what the global sum that is spent on advice, support and assistance in Scotland is? Whether it's UK government, Scottish government, local authorities, independent charities, third sector, do we know how much that would be? Does anyone map it?
I don't have it to hand.
Not aware of the figure.
No, I mean, there's been an advice service mapping exercise going on for some years, but as Richard was saying, I don't think that's reached a conclusion.
Right. I suppose it would be helpful because we don't know if the sum of money is adequate or otherwise, or whether they're significant. We haven't mapped it what the gaps in service are either. Then I would assume if that would be the case.
You've got the improvement service do an annual collation of statistics on it. Was originally money advice, but it has now expanded to welfare rights advice. And although it might not be 100%, because it's not compulsory that you comply, but they probably have the closest figures for the advice sector, which might be worth approaching.
Okay, and this was my final question. Would be, and this was sparked from the whole kind of help to claim monies going to citizens' advice and some local authorities losing out because of that, and that been a UK support for those seeking to claim universal credit up until they receive their first payment, and how that overlapped or duplicated or replicated other advice and assistance funding that some had previously come from UK government or even other areas. Do you think that the Scottish Government strategy for benefit uptake, now the statutory duty of course is for the devolved benefits, but should it be a strategy approach? So should they have a strategy, even if it's not their responsibility, to seek the uptake of all benefits that people in Scotland can take to support them in their daily lives?
We would agree with that. We would certainly agree with that. There's a disconnect if you think that somebody could come forward and say, can I get a Best Start grant? No, you're not in receipt of a UK reserve benefit. But if you claimed our new disability benefit, then that could then entitle you to the reserve benefit, and then you can come back to us and apply for the Best Start grant. Now, there's not going to be hundreds of those cases, but that's just an example of where, if you've got a disconnect, you're having to pass somebody over. And if it's not going to be the agency's duty to do that, then perhaps the agency needs to have good local referral pathways so that the individual doesn't then just feel dropped and abandoned.
And I think, to be fair, advice workers on the ground just got on with doing that job irrespective of where strategies sit. But I just wanted to just elicit whether you'd be supportive of that. Mr Wallace, did you want to say something before I move to Mr Balfour?
I suppose just to pick up to the last point of Richard's around about those connections and referrals is clearly what we would want to operate. The benefit uptake strategy obviously fulfils the duty under the Act, so is around about devolved benefits, and it remains the responsibility of DWP for those benefits that are reserved. So I think there's an element of how it operates on the ground, but I would certainly be, from the agency's perspective, slightly nervous around about an overt strategy that is targeting something that is not our responsibility to deliver.
And yeah, Judith Patterson, sorry, yes, did you want to come in there?
Yes, I think I totally understand David's point about the nervousness about actively promoting take-up of benefits that are UK benefits. However, if that's driven by fiscal framework concerns about transfers of money between governments, then we really need some clarity urgently on that, because it's not clear to me that the fiscal framework would ever require a transfer of funds purely because you increase take-up of a benefit without any policy change sitting behind it. I don't think that's what the fiscal framework's for. But in any case, if there's nervousness about that, then let's clarify that so we can actually provide a better service and increase take-up across the board. People don't live their lives in discrete chunks that way.
Can I thank you for putting that on the record, that our committee's been pursuing that area called policy spillover, where if the Scottish Government was to have a focused campaign which changed behaviour and meant more people were getting UK benefits they were entitled to, in theory, because it's never happened in practice, in theory the UK Government could seek recompense. In other words, the Scottish Government would have to pay for those receiving UK benefits if there was a identifiable evidence-based uptake, and it does lead to uncertainty. It wasn't the reason for asking the question, but it's very helpful for you to put some of that on the record. Judith. David Wallace, did you want to come back in?
No, again, I think from my perspective, from how the agency is involved in the benefit uptake strategy, the strategy fulfills the duty. We will play a role in the uptake strategy at the moment. That is about devolved benefits, and the linkages in the background is the bit that we're focused on.
Thank you very much. Jeremy, thanks for your patience. Jeremy,
Okay. No, thank you. I mean, I think some of that's been covered, but I suppose for my own clarification, you know, under the new Act, every person is entitled to advice and assistance from the start of the process. Just hearing from you, Mr. Gass, if that is going to be evolved around take-up, are you just saying at the moment there's not capacity within the system around advice and assistance, whether it's advice shops, CAB, whoever it is, that if we want to take that uptake and lots of people come to your doors, there's just going to be growing waiting lists, that there's not that capacity there at the moment? And just to follow on from Mr. Wallace's, I mean, I think it's very important that you are open, but can you just maybe put on record that you are not that advice and assistance? You're not the independent advice and assistance as referred to in the Act, and that if someone comes to you, you will be a signpost to whoever that service is locally best, rather than offering that advice and assistance.
And that's not you as David Wallace, but as
No,
Social Security Scotland.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. I think we've all been clear that this is about access to our services. You know, our local needs to be local to ensure consistency of access to our services, and referral on is an important part of that. Again, I'll come back to the previous point about flexibility of referral on. I think it's about relationships, about making these happen. Some of them will be micro-local, some of them will be national. But fundamentally, it's about working with existing services. This has never been about treading onto the footprint of other advice services.
Local authority welfare rights, and indeed the voluntary sector, although I'm not here to speak for them, we're all working to capacity. If there's an expectation that the folk who don't currently engage with us have a right to engage with us, then we do not have the resources to meet that demand at this time.
Fairly clear. Any other additional comments?
That's part of the Act which Jeremy Balfour referred to, the right for advice and assistance. Is that true of UK legislation as well?
I can comment.
No, I mean that's you in terms of social security. That's unique to Scotland. It's in the Social Security Scotland Act.
So it's a new entitlement that's been created.
A new entitlement. There is right to advice and assistance in other contexts. For example, for carers, which might be UK wide, but not for social security.
Okay. Are there any other questions from members before we draw this particular session to an end? Is there any additional comments that any of our witnesses would want to make? Just brief comments given the time. We're just keen to look at every aspect of how we can improve access to benefits people are entitled to. We can remove barriers, and we can do that in a sustainable way. So any final comments you want to make before we close this particular evidence session? Judith, don't have to say anything, but Judith Patterson, give you the opportunity if you wish to.
Thank you for the opportunity. Just in relation to the Scottish Government's first take-up strategy, which is really welcome, and it's fantastic that there is a duty on government to have a take-up strategy. I'm hoping to see when we get the next take-up strategy that we'll have gone beyond the focus on kind of awareness campaigns, important though that is, and move to a situation where it's more holistic, not just take up with Scottish Social Security, but across the board, and more to looking at how the advice sector is brought in to be linked with trusted professionals for that ongoing day-to-day embedded take-up activity.
Okay, thank you, Richard Gass.
Perhaps our most successful take-up campaigns, in the true sense of take-up campaigns, were run by Strathclyde Regional Council in the early 90s, and they focused on putting an advert in national newspapers, simply saying to people, if you feel you've missed out, cut out this piece of paper, sign it. Perhaps they didn't have a national insurance number, I can't remember the form exactly, but probably did, and send it back into Strathclyde Regional Council offices, and that was used to initiate a review of their then former supplementary benefit, or it was an appeal letter published again in the papers challenging a decision not to award them a severe disability premium. So that was very successful. So something similar today, and again I'm harping back perhaps to my QR code, but if there was some advert either in a newspaper or on television or on a leaflet that made it so very easy for an individual to initiate the claim, and perhaps the fineries of the claim can be listed at a later stage, but at least help somebody start the ball rolling, so it's not a case of, oh, I'll do that tomorrow when I get round to it. It's a case of, I'll do that right now because it takes no effort.
I think that's very helpful, and it might actually fit in with the Scottish Government take-up strategy, where it says there should be a series of benefit take-up weeks. Now, what that means or doesn't mean is another thing, but I think Mr Gash has given some suggestions as to what a clever use of limited funds might look like around those benefit take-up weeks. David Wallace?
I think just to emphasise a couple of points that have been made. So as I said at the opening, we are not yet into a fully steady state of the organisation. The benefit take-up marketing activity and comms activity we've done so far has inevitably been targeted at those launches of benefits. I think this will look different in the future than it does just now, and that goes across lots of the things that the organisation does. So I'd take Judith's point. The next strategy might look different from this one, and certainly our activities might look different at that point as well. What happens now isn't what's going to happen in steady state necessarily.
Okay, thank you. Well, can I thank all three of our witnesses this morning for giving your time to give evidence. Stay in contact with the inquiry. If there's any additional information you want to provide, please do that in due course. We'll endeavour to keep yourselves updated in the progress of our inquiry. So that ends agenda item 2. We'll suspend very briefly before we move to agenda item 3, but thank you very much this morning.